Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I want to show you this drawing of a roaring tiger done in colored pencil and pastel. I also want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about materials and how you can use some very cheap materials to create nice looking artwork. This whole drawing took about 2 hours or so, and now I'm going to be showing you the drawing process. I'm starting out with a sketch which was done with a combination of white colored pencil and graphite pencil. I just laid down some of the basic shapes and lines that I'm going to need. But the next stage here is drawing a little bit more complex sketch where I'm going to use a black colored pencil to put down some of these darker lines, darker shapes. And the reason why I'm using a black colored pencil is because colored pencils don't really smudge, and I'm going to be applying some pastel on top of them, and that way once I draw the sketch with these with a black colored pencil first, these lines will still remain visible. So first I'm going to put down some of these shapes where these stripes and spots are going to be, and then after it I'm going to go over that with various pastels, yellowish, orange and white tones to create a nice looking fur for this tiger. And then once I do that, I'm going to be going on top of those pastels with colored pencils again, using mostly brownish tones. But I also mentioned that I'm going to talk a little bit about materials. The first thing that you can see is that I'm using some kind of a toned paper, and I assure you this is a very cheap paper, because this is the kind of paper that you use for wrapping packages. And I liked its tone, I liked its color, and I decided to experiment with it a little bit. And I found that both colored pencils and pastels apply really well on top of it. So I decided to do a whole drawing on it. I know that a lot of people, when they work with pastels or colored pencils, they tend to spend a lot of money on materials. And I know that a lot of people in the comments often ask me what type of paper I use, what brand of pencils I use. I'll always give you the same answer. It's not important. It's really not important. You can use anything you like. You just have to adapt. You just have to adapt your pencils. You have to adapt your medium. The brands are completely irrelevant. If you're worrying about the brands, chances are you're not really serious about drawing. So don't worry about the brands. The brand of the paper is irrelevant. The brand of the pencil is irrelevant. The brand of the pastels is irrelevant. You can just use whatever you have at hand. So as a demonstration, I decided to use this wrapping paper to create this drawing of a tiger. But like I said, the paper has a nice color. It's a nice toned paper, and it's actually pretty durable. And as for its thickness, it's fairly thin, but it's kind of like a sketching paper, so it's not that bad. It'll be good enough. So these are my materials here on the left. I'm going to be using some of these pastels. And for blending those pastels, I'm going to be using this material, which is like a pad for a computer mouse, and I'll just cut off a piece of it, and I use pieces of that foamy material to blend pastel because I find that it pushes the pastel into the paper really well. In addition to that, I'll also be using tortillons and brushes and some other stuff. But like I said, I mostly like to use cheap materials, and they work pretty well. The pastels, those orangey and reddish pastels that I'm going to be using, are woodless Master's Touch pencils, pastel pencils. They're pretty cheap brand because they don't really have that much pigment, but I find that any pastel pencil can produce vibrant colors in comparison to the colored pencils, so I think they will be fine. You can see that I started out by laying down some of the white in these lighter areas. But what I'm using now is not a pastel pencil, it's a colored pencil. It's a white colored pencil that I'm going to use to draw some of these white hairs around the eyes and the whiskers. And on a toned paper, a white colored pencil will actually leave a pretty nice mark. Here I'm using a white charcoal pencil, although you can also use a white pastel pencil or a soft pastel, white soft pastel, it doesn't really matter. So as you can see, tiger's fur has several colors. White is one of them. So I'm filling in some of these lighter areas around the eyes and around the mouth. And once I do that, I'm going to be going in with some of the darker ones, darker colors. But the thing is that I am laying down this white even in those areas where which won't be white, because I want to blend it and make it a little bit lighter. So I'm going to be using a couple of orange pastels, and one of them is a little bit more yellowish, and the other one has a little bit more red in it. And I'm hoping that in a combination with this toned paper and with the colored pencils that I'm gonna use on top of it, that it won't remain orange, that I'm going to get a color that's going to look a lot more realistic and that's going to resemble the tiger fur a lot more. And this portion around the neck is also a little bit lighter. So now I'm using that blending tool of mine to spread the pastels around and to blend them in and to push the pigment into the paper. Like I said, I'm going to be blending that and drawing on top of that as well, so I don't need it to be completely white. And I'm going to go over some of these areas with an orange. In addition to that spongy blending tool, I can also use a brush here and there. and I'm also putting down some of the lighter areas and the highlights in the eye. I'm going to add a little bit of yellowish tones to the eye, but it's mostly going to be fairly light. And now you can see that I'm adding in some of these darker areas, darker spots and stripes, using a black pencil. For this I can either use a black pastel or a charcoal pencil. I tend to prefer charcoal because it just kind of sticks to the surface a little bit better. So while I'm applying the charcoal pencil, I'm trying to create irregular shapes and imitate the appearance of short fur. And this area around the mouth, the gums are really dark, so I'm just going to use black. Now I know that some people would criticize me for using black for these stripes, because in reality the tiger stripes aren't really black. I think they're actually very dark ochre or dark brownish color. But the thing is that once I blend that with a base color and go over it with some of these brownish colored pencils, I think I'm going to get it to look a lot more realistic. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because I'm just trying to approximate certain things. I'm trying to make it close to what it looks like in real life. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, obviously. I want this top part here to be lighter, so I'm applying a little bit of white pencil on top of that yellowish fur. And now I'm using that sharp white colored pencil to draw some of these whiskers. And like I said, a white colored pencil, as you can see, will show up really well against toned paper. But the trick is to try to do this in a single motion and to twist the pencil a little bit. That way you push more of that pigment into the paper and you get nicer white lines with a little bit more contrast. So here I added a little bit of pink pastel for the nose, and I'm working around it with my colored pencils to add some of the shorter hairs and smaller details. And because the tiger is growling, there are wrinkles around the nose and the eyes, so I have to shade that area and shade around those wrinkles using mostly the browns. The browns that I'm using are burnt sienna, which is kind of a reddish brown color. It's a Faber-Castell pencil that I'm using, and the other one is Van Dyke brown. So I'm mostly using these two on top of the pastel that I laid down as my base color. And of course I have to do that with the other areas of the tiger's body as well, because I want to give it shape and volume. Obviously, if I don't do that, the tiger will look flat, and I don't want my subject to end up looking flat. So now moving on to these smaller stripes around the head, and you can see that some of them appear as dots and lines from this angle of viewing. That's because the head is well, mostly a round object, so from our angle some of them will appear as thin lines and others will appear a lot thicker. And now I'm working on the ear. It has a lighter white patch on the ear there, which I found surprising, but whatever. So I put down a little bit of white there as well, and I'm putting some stripes on the ear. I'm going to have to shade the area under the ear a little bit darker and around the ear so that the ear stands out a little bit more. So now I'm just continuing to work on the stripes. As you can see, I'm trying to use a very short back and forth motion to create like a sort of a jagged shape that kind of looks like fur. So I'm using my strokes so as to imitate the appearance of the fur, and I have to keep those strokes shorter because obviously the length of the fur varies depending on the part of the body of the animal. It's a little bit shorter on the head and near the snout, and it gets longer as you move further away from the head. It's longer here around the neck, and it's of course longer elsewhere on the body. So you can see that the areas on the rest of the head apart from the nose are looking kind of flat now. That's because a lot of shading is needed, and I'm going to be going over those areas with a colored pencil, with brownish colored pencils later as well. Here you can see that I'm using tortillon to blend some of these black areas, and I'm using that to soften my strokes and make the fur look a little softer and fluffier in certain areas. I'm just going to add a little bit more white here on this right side of the tiger's body, which is mostly around the chest, but not all of it is going to remain completely white. I'm adding in these areas because I want a softer transition. I want the fur to be lighter there, so it's not necessarily going to remain white. The same goes for this other side on the left as well. I'm just going to blend that in a little bit with my finger because that'll do. Now I'm just going to continue working on the body, adding more of this orange pastel. Like I said, these are Master's Touch woodless pastel pencils. They're not the greatest, they're not very soft, and they don't really have that much pigment, but like I said, any pastel in comparison to colored pencils will produce very rich, vibrant colors, because with colored pencils it really takes quite a bit more patience and a little bit more pressure actually to produce more vibrant colors. With pastels it's very easy. It's very easy to cover large areas and get some really nice looking colors. But I do think that without the stone paper and without the colored pencils that I'm going to apply on top of that orange, the orange wouldn't really look very realistic. It wouldn't really look like the tiger's fur, because the tiger's fur isn't exactly orange. It has some reddish, ochre, brownish tones, so it's a little bit more complex than that. So I'm going to try to imitate that as best as I can, and I'm hoping that my colored pencils and the tone paper are going to help me with that. I'm just working on the tongue and the gums, adding in some of the lighter details. And I'm also adding a little bit of brown here as well, because I don't want the white fur around the mouth to remain completely white. I'm adding in some more of these whiskers with a white colored pencil, but if I find that it's not showing up or that I need more contrast, I could just go over some of these lines a little bit with white gel pen. I tend to use gel pen very sparingly, but with colored pencils I find that it integrates well with the rest of the drawing, so it's fine. Now I'm just adding a little more detail to the teeth and trying to make them stand out against the background a little bit more. Adding a few more hairs here to make this transition between the white and the orange or the yellowish parts of the fur a little more realistic. And I'm also adding a little more detail and texture to these dark stripes as well, using a black colored pencil. So I think you get now what my approach is. I basically use pastels or charcoal for blocking in, and then I use the colored pencils on top for the details and to add some additional tones. So here again I'm adding a few of these darker stripes and details on the neck, and like I said, because of the angle that we're looking at the animal, these appear as thin lines, and as they get closer to us here, they are getting wider and wider. So because the head is turning to one side, I also have to make the stripe follow that direction a little bit. And I'm adding in some of the larger, thicker stripes here because I'm moving on to the upper back or the shoulders, the tiger's body. And here you can see I'm using a brown colored pencil to work on the ear and around the ear, because I want to make the ear stand out a little bit more. And I'm also using my tortillon to work over those stripes that I created, and what that's doing is making my strokes softer, making the fur appear thicker and softer and fluffier in certain places, and it's also blending these darker stripes with the ochreish layer underneath, because I said that I'm kind of hoping to make those stripes look a little more realistic, because in real life they aren't really black, they're mostly like dark ochre or brownish, darker brown, even though they appear pretty dark, almost black. But you can see that I'm going over them a little bit and refining both their shape and their tone with my brown colored pencils. And right now I'm using a burnt sienna colored pencil on these yellowish parts of the fur to give it more texture. And you can see that I'm adding a little bit more in certain areas where I want the fur to be darker. So this is all about giving the tiger more volume and texture and detail, so that it looks more realistic and so that it kind of pops out of the paper a little bit more. And to further refine these stripes, I can also use a black colored pencil. So I'm hoping that you will like my approach to drawing this tiger. I know that there will be people who will disapprove of both my techniques and my materials, but I'm just trying to show you that you don't necessarily have to use expensive materials. Any type of paper will work fine, and cheaper pencils and cheaper pastels will also get the job done. You just have to adapt. There are a couple of pieces of advice that I always keep telling people and repeating on my channel. The first one obviously is that drawing is a nice hobby and that you should have one too, because I believe that everybody should have a hobby if possible, and drawing is a really nice hobby. But the other piece of advice that I keep repeating is not to worry about materials, not to worry about the brands of the paper or the pencils, because that really tends to give people excuse to procrastinate and just not actually draw. So if you want to draw, you can just pick up any kind of pencil that you have at home and just start drawing. Now I sharpened this orange pastel pencil a little bit, and you can see that I'm trying to add a little more detail here to the fur. I'm pushing that orange pencil into these darker stripes to make the fur look a little more realistic. And in order to achieve this, first your pastel pencil needs to be fairly sharp, and the second thing you need to do is kind of twist it a little bit as you push it, because when you twist it, it will leave a nice pointy mark and push that pigment into the darker area, which otherwise it isn't that easy. And another thing that you have to do occasionally is just rub the tip off with your fingers to clean it up. So you can see that I added some nice touches, some nice details to the fur, and now I'm just adding some flyaway white hairs here and there, basically putting down some of the finishing touches before I spray the drawing with a fixative. I'm trying to make this portion of the tiger's body a little bit lighter here on the left. That way it will stand out even more against the background of this stoned paper. And just adding a little more value to this area here around the mouth. Like I said, it's very important to give your subject volume so that it doesn't look flat. Alright. Here you can see that I removed the tape, and I'm just playing around with the drawing a little bit, adding a few details here and there, but the drawing is mostly done and it's time to sign it. So there it is. I hope you enjoyed this narrated video of my drawing of a roaring tiger, and I hope that you'll like my approach and my use of cheaper materials. You should also check out some of my other videos and maybe subscribe to my channel. I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.